Welcome to my latest para-documentary, which actually starts in the village of Canewdon in Essex. Why Canewdon? I'm hoping to focus upon the ghostly legends associated with this church, the Church of St Nicholas, and also its nefarious reputation for witchcraft, and to examine more closely in detail the background and origins of some of the legends attached to the church, which, if to be believed, would make Canewdon one of the most actively witchcraft-infested areas in the entire world. But of course, as one knows through life, that quite often, once you've separated truth from fiction, the true reality of these places is nothing more different than perhaps to other locations within the county of Essex and elsewhere. And of course, I'm hoping to examine them in much more detail. But firstly, let's look at the church here of St Nicholas. It is of late medieval origin, and this magnificent tower, which stands on a hill promontory, rises 123 feet above sea level and gives unparalleled views across the valley. And certainly, perhaps through history, it may have been used as a possible defensive position, and more certainly as a lookout. And the tower was constructed as celebration for the English victory over the French following the Battle of Agincourt in the year 1415. And certainly today, the tower can be seen from many locations at great distances as you approach this area. And it's, shall we say, quite a landmark which most people, and particularly so boats using the nearby river, have used as a navigable feature. The actual origins of the name Canewdon dates back to Saxon times and means basically Hill of Canna's people. Certainly King Canute, on his campaigns across England, had a base camp nearby and may well have used this promontory as it afforded such a good view across the neighbouring valleys and hills. But firstly, let's deal with why I'm here. I'm hoping to, after I've visited the village of Canewdon, to travel over to Felsted in Essex, which has a personal association with me, perhaps with a possible witch and witchcraft, and to the village of Manningtree and Mistley in Essex, which was the home base of Matthew Hopkins, self-styled Witchfinder General in the 17th century, who, during his time, dispensed, or should we say serial murdered, with his assistant Mr Stern, over 300 innocent women. But let's firstly look at the alleged reputation for witchcraft associated with this church and the village. If we examine the court records and testimonials of actual witchcraft trials here in the village of Canewdon, we have to look firstly in the year 1585, when a local spinster by the name of Rose Pye appeared before the court here, accused of bewitching to death a 12-month-old baby by the name of Joanna Snow, who lived at nearby Scaldhurst Farm. On this occasion, the court showed leniency because the evidence to convict was insufficient. But by a cruel twist of fate, although she was acquitted, she actually died in prison because she was unable to pay her release fee. And sadly, 5 years later, a lady by the name of Cicely Makin, or Goodwife Makin, appeared before the court here, charged with practicing witchcraft. Here, of course, on this occasion, they showed a degree of leniency. They gave her 5 years to mend her ways and to return back to the teachings of Christ. Suffice to say that 5 years following, she was back again before the same court, where instead of being executed or being imprisoned or tortured, on this occasion, by modern standards, they showed a degree of leniency because she was excommunicated from the church. But by the standards of medieval England, that meant her soul was going to be consigned to hell. As Cicely Makin was obviously a practicing Wiccan, that wasn't much of a threat, and as far as we're aware, from that period onwards, she was able to live her life out peaceably. After these two trials in Canoodan, there appears to be no further records indicating that any other citizens of this village were brought to trial accused of witchcraft, which of course cannot be said for other parts of England, and particularly in this county of Essex and Suffolk, where witchcraft was considered to be quite a prevalent and common offence. But what Canoodan is particularly known for are its legends associated with witchcraft and the rituals of witchcraft that are connected to this village and of course to this church. One of the most interesting characters that could be connected to the village of Canoodan was a man by the name of George Pickingill, who was born in 1813 and died in the village in the year 1909. And it's believed that he's buried somewhere in the churchyard, but without a headstone. George was known as a cunning man. Cunning in this case meant that he was a witch and had practiced his worship to a horned god, allegedly. And during his lifetime, although employed as a farm worker, many people used to go to him for cures for many ailments and warts, and also to improve crops and so on and so forth, which he could give some kind of potion or make some kind of spell. It is said that he walked along a hedgerow and touched it with a stick. All the animals in the hedgerow would run out and they could easily be captured and caught for gain. It was also said that if anyone crossed swords with George, their life and indeed their prosperity in life could be severely hampered by what George could do in the manner of witches and spells. The problem with the legend of George Pickingill is that despite all these grand claims that are added to his reputation, most of those were actually discovered, as it were, some 50 years after his death by the writer Eric Maple, who went around many old age people's homes interviewing some of the elderly residents to get their take upon the legend of George Pickingill. And of course, as one gets older, one's memory tends to fade, and certainly in this case, his reputation was, shall we say, somewhat elaborated by those that he spoke to. It was said that if you went to his cottage just on the outskirts of the village and looked through the window during the evening time, you could see his familiars in the form of mice suckling at his nipples, and all manner of weird and wonderful tales associated with this man were researched by this writer of folklore, Eric Maple. And of course, going further into, I believe, the 1970s, an American by the name of Lefebvre also added more to the reputation of George Pickingill. And so, as a witch and as a cunning man, he somehow shone out from all of the other witches that are recorded and known who were operating within the county of Essex. But George Pickingill was no fool, and he was also a person that liked to rewrite the rituals of his worship to witchcraft, the horned god, and was also a man who was known to make some fairly grand statements. For example, he claimed that he had 9 covens across the county of Essex, and also believe in neighbouring counties such as Hertfordshire. And that on one occasion he had a showdown with another witch where he struck this witch down dead with his magic. And of course all this added to his reputation as a man to be feared, and certainly the villagers and indeed the church did fear him regardless. He claimed that he could sit quietly smoking a pipe while he would employ imps to bring in the crops from the farmer's field, and that farmers would pay him extra money to be able to perform these miracles on their behalf. Another reputation added to the legend of Aleister Crowley, for example, was that he was at one time a disciple of George Pickingill, and that he was eventually thrown out from the sect for his behaviour, which was considered to be outside their teachings and practices. However, Further research in later years by other researchers can find no evidence of any connection between Aleister Crowley and George Pickingill. And yet we can prove here that in later years people have added more to the legend of George Pickingill, which today has given rise to the fact that Canoodan is regarded as the focal point of witchcraft in the county of Essex. And indeed, if one needs further proof that the reputation of witchcraft in Canoodan was a concoction of the 19th century, there's a local rhyme which says that there will always be 6 witches in the village, 3 of cotton and 3 of silk. Well, if that had been something which was claimed to be a medieval saying, then surely it would not have been cotton, it would have been wool. Cotton was a discovery of the 19th century, and certainly during the era of George Pickingill. Without going into more detail about his magical claims and what he could do and what he could not do and his victims, it was quite clear that he had a grudge against the church and at many times had run-ins with the local priest. It is claimed that when he died, he was walking through the churchyard at Canoodan when, at night, daylight suddenly appeared from behind a cross, a stone cross in the cemetery, which reflected upon him and struck him dead. Nothing could be further from the truth. He actually fell ill at home and he was taken to a hospice, but eventually he died of old age and was subsequently buried in the churchyard. Certainly there are many, many legends and attachments between the church and its association with witchcraft. It is alleged that should a stone fall from the tower of the church, it would indicate that one of the 6 witches inside the village had died and that another was due to take their place. And still adding to the legend of the tower and the witches, that so long as the church tower stands, there will always be witches in the village. Apparently, anyone who walks around the tower at midnight could be forced to dance with witches. And apparently at Halloween, if you go around the tower 7 times, you will see a witch. 13 times, you will become invisible. If you run around the tower anti-clockwise on Halloween, the devil will apparently appear before you. And more interestingly, if you run around the tower backwards 3 times, a portal will appear before you and you will be able to travel back through time. Now, of course, I have yet to find any reference to any person who has claimed to have experienced any of these experiences inside the churchyard at Canoodan. And again, it's something that people have welded to the legend of George Pickingill and to witches inside the village, which has made it such a fascinating place for study, and particularly for folklore and local anecdotes. I certainly don't feel that Canoodan is perhaps any more haunted with witches or infested with witches, whichever way you want to look at it, than anywhere else in the country. But what I find particularly intriguing about the whole deal is that if we go back to the 17th century, we have the witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins persecuting innocent people, accusing them of being witches. And in the 19th century, we have George Pickingill doing exactly the reverse, but this time on church members of the local congregation. A certain irony, perhaps, and one which, of course, has stuck quite firmly in my mind since I started to research this particular documentary. I find these legends and local anecdotes to be fascinating, but by and large, I regard them as just that, anecdotes and stories, nothing more. But they do add a rich character to the fabric of what the village of Canoodan is to this day. And sadly, because of it, it attracts a lot of people there at night, and the church have been forced to add security gates to prevent people from entering at night. And it is also fair to say that some people have gone into the churchyard and have seriously damaged headstones, because on one portion of the churchyard, the cemetery, it is absolutely devoid of any headstones, which have been ripped up and smashed up in the past. which perhaps is a tragedy to the history of the village and our knowledge of the past. Apart from the church and the village's association with witchcraft, the church has two notable ghostly legends attached to it. The most notorious has been seen on a number of occasions. A lady wearing a poke bonnet hat who has no face, who has been seen to pass through the west gate in the car park at the front of the church and disappear down before the river. And on one night, a lady was parked outside who had no knowledge of its ghostly reputations. When she saw this apparition, she saw that it had no facial features. She was petrified and she fled in flight from this sighting and never to return again to the church. No doubt today, probably to recall that situation with horror and fear of what happened to her on that particular night. But apart from that, there's also been an alleged headless ghost seen inside the churchyard who's been known to deposit his victims in neighbouring ditches. Quite how true any of these legends are, one can only conjecturise. But I would have thought that the occasion of the lady who saw the figure with a poke bonnet face is probably one of the more truthful elements attached to any of the ghostly sightings here. But what is more particularly worrying and frightening for any visitors to this churchyard are its associations with witches and some of the rituals which have been seen and performed inside this very active churchyard. I'm actually standing outside this rather delightful timber frame building in the village of Felsted in Essex, which, as you can see, was built by George Boot in the year 1596. Certainly today it stands out as an interesting feature, and particularly so when it's opposite the Guildhall and the beautiful church here. And of course Felsted is noted for its public school. But coming back to this building, it also has an addition which you don't find on any other buildings in this area, and that is known locally as the Felsted Hag, and allegedly depicts, according to the builder, a carving of his wife. She, being a rather plain and ugly woman, he decided to display that more as a joke rather than with reference to anything else. But if you look more closely at this figure, which is actually a support bracket, you'll notice that she has cloven feet and she also has exposed breasts and appears to be restrained or held back and contained on the side of the building. I think the truth here is that the figure was carved as a grotesque to ward off evil. We have only got to go back 3 years earlier, in the year 1593, when a local spinster at the age of 59 years, a woman by the name of Alice Albert, was declared to be a witch. According to a local farmer, she had hexed a number of his animals which fell ill and died. And she apparently had bewitched them. And in order to gain retribution against her, he complained to the local magistrate here, who issued a warrant for her arrest and she was taken to Chelmsford Assizes, where, along with a number of other innocent women, she was judged guilty of witchcraft and she was hung. One can also imagine that she was probably tortured at great length, where under torture, under pressure, she may have admitted to anything at all. But there the story doesn't quite end. And this is where I come into the picture. A few years ago, I came to this village to shoot a piece on George Boot House and some of the other buildings and the church. And as I was carrying my camera across the road to get a better view of George Boot House, I was standing in a central position, as you can see from this short clip here, when I recorded the most unusual EVP. If you listen closely, the background audio is completely wiped out and it's substituted by this very evil sounding voice. A number of voice analysts have listened to this at length and have declared that they can find no logical or reasonable explanation for that voice to be there. And so I think it's fair to say, and most certain to say, that that is EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, which was inadvertently recorded by me as I carried the camera across the road. Could there be an association between that EVP, the legend of George Boot House, and the poor spinster Alice Albert? And of course today I can't answer that question. I can only surmise that there may be a tenuous connection. Perhaps many centuries ago, when George Boot built this beautiful house, that Alice Albert had lived very local to where the restaurant is today. And perhaps Alice Albert's spirit still reigns supreme in this part of the village of Felsted. As I said, I'm only speculating. It's just idle speculation, only from what I recovered on camera. Certainly a strange place to record EVP in the middle of a busy road, but it happened. And so did, of course, the legend of Alice Albert and the Felsted Hag, which today still intrigues and fascinates many tourists that come to this area. And so now we move on to another area much noted with witchcraft, but in later years, in fact in the 17th century. The final part of my documentary on Essex witches actually brings me to the villages of Mistley and Manningtree. In fact, I'm standing within the grounds of Mistley Towers. Manningtree and Mistley will always be connected with one man, the nemesis of all witches in the 17th century, a man by the name of Matthew Hopkins, the son of a Puritan priest who was born in Great Wenham in Suffolk in the year 1620, and following the death of his father, who was quite a wealthy man, owning tenements at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, he came to this area with 100 marks as part of his father's will, where he purchased the Mistley Fawn Hotel. Today there is still a Mistley Fawn Hotel, but unfortunately it's not the original building that Hopkins purchased. It was torn down much earlier, and a later version was built in the year 1735. Whilst here, he came across an alleged witchcraft trial that was being prosecuted at the behest of villagers by a man of the name of John Stern. He actually appeared at the trial and listened to how Stern presented his evidence, and obviously at that point decided to throw his lot in with Stern to carry out their own investigations into witchcraft. because it was patently obvious that people were willing to pay for the death of other people. And before long, they had actually formed a company which involved 3 professional witch identifiers. These were women who knew the signs of a witch, and Stern employed as a witch pricker. They were certainly psychopaths. They had no feelings or remorse for their victims, and they were handsomely rewarded, not only to dispose of alleged witches by identifying them, but also innocents that other people were prepared to pay good sums of cash for to be rid of them. In fact, by the end of his reign, he had accrued the princely sum of £1,000, which by modern standards would place him within a level close to being a millionaire. So it was certainly a very, very profitable exercise. And the sad part about all of this was the fact that this occurred during the English Civil War. So there was no proper lawful jurisdiction by authorities, because some could be under the control of the royalists, others could be under the control of the parliamentarians. And so Hopkins was able to work within this grey area, and he even had a letter of good conduct to allow him through 2 different areas in order to carry out his alleged persecutions of witches. It is believed by the end of his reign that he had murdered over 300 women, and also some men too, and on one occasion had persecuted an elderly priest who he accused of being a witch. Quite clearly, Hopkins had gone beyond his remit as a witch finder general and was a psychopath completely out of control. Now, why would people want somebody persecuted as a witch? Well, most of his victims were poor, penniless, elderly widows, easy victims to torture and to confess to alleged crimes, and as a result of their prosecution, they would receive a financial settlement from the grateful villagers. And the reasons behind all of this mostly were the fact that the Great Plague existed during that period of history, and of course there were a number of ailments and diseases affecting livestock, which all could be attributed to the work of a witch. Nobody really understood the mechanics of science at that period of history. It was still very much in its infancy, and particularly with medicine. And so if somebody fell sick, or if their animals fell ill, it had to be the work of a witch. Of course, there is no testimony following any of these persecutions that any of these animals or people recovered from their alleged ailments as a result of a witch being persecuted and tried. And certainly during their early days here in Mistley and Manningtree, they prosecuted and had hung 19 women from this area who were completely innocent of any crime of witchcraft. In fact, during the early days, in the year 1645, most of their early victims were tried by water at the infamous Hopping Bridge, which can still be seen today along the walls at Mistley. And here victims were tied to chairs and thrown over the side into the pond below. If they died, they were clearly innocent, but if they floated back to the surface, they were obviously guilty as a witch, and they were later taken to Colchester, where they were tried and hung. And indeed today in the castle basement are the remains of the cells in which a number of these poor women were incarcerated. But it can be considered that they would have been cold, they would have been damp, and the victims would have been stripped naked and beaten. Other methods to detect witches could be signs of a witch, particularly if people have warts or moles. These are normally signs of witches, apparently. Or if people have an extra nipple, which is definitely the mark of the devil, and so on and so forth. I in fact have a birthmark on my back, which quite clearly could indicate that I'm a witch, because if you look at this birthmark, it actually resembles a witch on the broomstick. So had I lived in the 17th century and was wrongly and falsely accused of being a witch, I would not legally have been able to defend myself. Such was the savagery and the bigotry of that period of history. Methods they employed to extract confessions and to prove their guilt, that was simply by using a blunt knife placed against their arms, and of course a blunt knife would not cut their skin and would not draw blood, which was a sure sign of witchcraft, or by using a knife with a retractable blade, so that the knife would appear to pass through the victim's arm and be retracted with no trace of any blood or indeed any cuts to the skin, which was also a sure sign of witchcraft. It's believed that Hopkins drew his inspiration from the works of King James I, who wrote a book on demonology. It is also suggested that for a period he was employed as a clerk in Holland, where he learnt much of the continental methods of detecting witches. All bar one of his victims were hung. Only one was burnt at the stake, whereas that practice of burning at the stake of witches was fairly commonplace throughout Europe. One of the questions that arises is, why didn't Hopkins visit Canewdon in Essex? And the suggestion is that he was too terrified of the witches there. Well, as I've shown in the earlier part of my documentary, the alleged witchcraft in the village was more a confection of the 19th century, and he had no reason or call to go there, and I'm fairly sure that someone like Hopkins would not easily be dissuaded from attending a village which was noted to be haunted with witches. It is interesting to note that Hopkins produced in the year 1647 the discovery of witches, which he used in his defence against the priest John Gall at Great Staunton in Huntingdonshire, who denounced him as a witch. Huntingdon was perhaps his last final battle, and he was forced to retreat, and suffering from an illness of a chest infection, he went back to his home in Manningtree in South Street, which in fact today is an empty lot next to the Red Line Public House, where he died of his illness. Within hours, Hopkins had been buried in the grounds of Misley Church, not this churchyard, but another church which sadly no longer exists today, and so we are unable to place exactly where Hopkins is interred. But suffice to say that his legacy lives on for eternity. The discovery of witches was taken across to America by the early settlers to the town of Salem in Massachusetts, where it was put to good employment in another reign of terror, which is known today as the Salem witch trials. Today, the legacy of Matthew Hopkins still lives on in the form of his ghosts. Apparently, he has been seen at Hopping Bridge, walking along the walls area facing the River Stour. Also, ghostly and mysterious screams have been heard coming across from the salt marsh, which is believed to be the spirits of some of his victims. He apparently has been heard inside the Misley Fawn Hotel on the upper floor, walking up and down as a restless spirit perhaps. And lastly, at the White Hart Hotel in Manningtree, where his spirit is allegedly said to haunt. Quite how true any of these stories are, I cannot attest. But I can say that for a long, long time thereafter, the legacy of Matthew Hopkins will live on in this area, perhaps as a vessel to sell tourism, or perhaps for people to come and reminisce over the terrible deeds carried out by two men in the 17th century. Well, I've arrived at a church which for me has many fond memories, having been here on numerous occasions in the past. I'm actually at St Edmund's Church on the island of Mersey in Essex, and this is actually at the eastern side of the island. There is another church at the western end. This particular church has an interesting history. It took over 200 years to construct and dates from the 12th, 13th, 14th and 15th centuries respectively. So there's been an ongoing development here over the centuries, which has brought us today to this fine church that stands here as testament to the craftsmanship of the medieval past. And very light and airy, has a wonderful ambience, and is certainly something that I'd love to come back to whenever I have the occasion. and it's great to be back here today. Unusually, perhaps, it's sunny outside and there is very little wind, which gives me great opportunity to share with you one of the legends outside associated with this church. But let's have a wander around. This church has probably got the most unusual pulpit which I've seen anywhere. You'll notice that the pulpit and its hourglass shape is actually created on top of a column. And the reason for that simply was that up until 1920, this church was filled with box pews. So the height of the pews would have touched just below the actual panelling here from which the priest would stand. These are a rare sight in churches. Mostly the ones that you find are made from wood, but this is cast in brass and probably dates to the 19th / early 20th century. It's a particularly fine piece and obviously well looked after and well cleaned. One can just imagine the prohibitive cost even for that period of history. But nevertheless, it's quite beautiful, isn't it? There are two interesting exhibits I want to share with you now, part of the church furniture as it were. One is this wooden framed plaque to the memory of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Bellamy, citizen and fishmonger, late of this parish, who deceased the 28th of August in the year 1656 at the age of 59. And considering its age and how far it actually goes back, and the fact that it's still here and is so well perfectly preserved, this is indeed an enjoyable rarity to actually see inside a church today. And next to it we have a staircase, a medieval staircase in stone, which goes up but comes out at the top there, which was originally access to the rood loft, and the rood screen used to literally run across here, separating the chancel from the nave. And of course the rood screen has long since disappeared, but there are still references to the fact that it actually existed, and to see it as a curiosity is quite fun, really. A detail which I always appreciate, particularly so in medieval churches, are these large archways which separate this part of the church, of the nave, from the adjoining chapel. From the detail that I can see, these would probably date to the late 14th, early 15th century, and even to this day the preservation of the detail of the carving is still there. There's virtually no damage, and it seems to have survived history fairly well. And certainly a credit to the church authorities here, which maintain this building in such a high state of renovation and repair. Just over here we have a rather attractive late 14th, early 15th century medieval font with ecclesiastical carvings around the panelled sides, which is particularly interesting. Let's have a much closer look. Certainly just looking at this piece, there's some fine carving here of arches, and here is an empty space. I can only assume at some point this may have contained an image of a now proscribed saint, which may have been taken away. There's certainly other panels which attest to the fact that there may have been something else there originally. But having said all that, the detail is still very strong. It's, albeit slightly chipped and damaged after centuries of use and bearing some signs of graffiti, it's still very much here today and very much used and enjoyed by the people that celebrate at this church. There are two historical characters attached to the church which I wish to go into some detail with. One, I will need to travel outside to the grave of a 15-year-old girl, and the other perhaps to a famous author and was also the priest here in the 19th century. But let's wander outside first and let's look at the legend of Sarah Wrench. One of the most unusual and perhaps one of the saddest burials here in the churchyard at St Edmund's Church in East Mersey in Essex is an iron-caged grave bearing the legend of Sarah Wrench, who died May the 6th, 1848, aged 15 years and 5 months. But she is buried alone in unconsecrated ground. Nobody actually knows who Sarah Wrench was, and certainly there's no record of her birth, which in those days wasn't particularly unusual, unfortunately. But for a burial to take place here in East Mersey from somebody from Peldon, and there's no record of her death or birth, then it seems rather odd, to say the very least. But anyway, I digress. A lot of people believe that this grave had this iron cage or mort safe placed over it to prevent a group of people known as resurrectionists or burkers from removing her body and selling it for medical research. First of all, let's examine the fact that the resurrectionists, as they were known, may have been intent on removing her body to be sold to a medical school, either in London or Cambridge, which would have been the nearest medical schools for that period of history, where obviously they would have received a bountiful price for her corpse. That to me is a rather fanciful explanation. So now we must look at the facts in more detail. Sarah was a native of Peldon village, which in those days would have taken by horse or cart probably around 40 minutes on the terribly unmade roads which existed in those days. And say, just for example, if it was a grave robber, he would have to know that she had recently died, and he would also have to know that she has been buried here. For him to even dream of removing the corpse and taking it by cart to the nearest railway station of that period, which was Colchester, which would have taken probably 2 or 3 hours on the roads that existed. And then the long journey into London, and then having to explain to people why they're carrying a cadaver of a young girl. And then, of course, if you were a resident here on Mersey Island, you would have to know somebody in a medical school in London who would be prepared to break the law and buy this corpse. And I'm coming back again to what the locals believed that she was at the time of her death. It was suggested that she was a witch, and that was the reason that she was buried with an iron cage to prevent her from rising again and tormenting the locals. By modern science and understanding of the world, this is a completely ridiculous notion, but understandable when you look at the mindset, as I've explained, of the people from that period. I find the whole event surrounding her death and also the grave robbers of old highly repellent, really, and quite sad when you look at things and examine them under a modern light. But you have to remember, for example, between 1506 and 1752, such was the interest in the human anatomy by medical schools that the supply of human bodies, cadavers, had completely dried up. And so they decided to introduce a piece of legislation which was known as the Murder Act, which allowed convicted felons who were executed as part of their punishment for their bodies to be taken away for free by medical schools for their medical classes. And of course, as the interest in medical science grew and blossomed, and particularly so in Edinburgh and in London, where medical schools there were receiving students from all over the world, such was the interest, the supply of convicted bodies grew less and less, because also at the same time it reflected a social change in society. No longer were people going to be executed for the most minor of offences, and so that ready supply of bodies completely dried up there. So the only course for further action to enable them to continue their business was to employ or to do business with these people that were known as resurrectionists or burkers. Burker comes from Messrs Burke and Hare, who were Irish immigrants living in Edinburgh, who I believe between 1827 and 1828 murdered, I believe, up to 16 people and sold their bodies to an unscrupulous doctor at an Edinburgh medical school, and that these supply of bodies were taken without question by the said medical school, and when they were eventually caught and convicted and executed, no punishment was dealt out to the doctors involved at the medical practices. And in fact, in the case of Burke, his skeleton was placed on public display, his body was dissected, book covers were made from his skin, and also appointment card folders were also created from his skin. The end result was that after Burke and Hare were arrested and convicted, there was a huge landslide in change with regard to the care of bodies after death, because up until then nobody had really given it a second thought. After they brought in legislation, they decided that in future all deaths should be properly registered with certificates that accompanied each corpse to ensure that those who had control over a corpse had the correct paperwork giving them authorization to do so, which obviously cuts out the middleman, the tomb robber, who would remove these bodies for sale. So in 1848, here in East Mersey, I can give you a rough idea of what life was like here. It was fairly harsh. There was mostly farmers and people who made their living from the sea. They weren't particularly wealthy. Of course, there were landowners. But importantly, in this, should we say, forgotten corner of the United Kingdom, why on earth would anybody want to place a mortsafe over a young girl's grave? My view, whichever the legend is with regard to Sarah Wrench, is that she was not a witch. She was a victim of a narrowed social mentality which pervaded in England at that time. I think that, and according to the facts that she was indeed pregnant, I think that in her village she was confronted over her pregnancy, and she obviously didn't wish to name the father of the child, and so she lied. And she may have said something to the effect that she had been raped by a demon or something like that. What you have to understand is that in the year 1848, and despite the witchcraft trials of the 17th century, people still here, and particularly so in Essex and in Suffolk, had these deep-rooted fears of the devil, an almost peasant virus, as it were, which completely possessed the minds of most God-fearing Christians who lived in these remote rural districts. And if proof be needed, the last witch trial occurred in Essex, actually in the 1860s, in the village of Sybil Headingham, where the villagers decided that a deaf and dumb mute, who was believed to be French, a man by the name of Zani, was a witch, and he was tried by being doused into water. As a result, this poor man caught pneumonia and died. But that's beside the point. It shows, though, that this mentality surrounding the paranormal and surrounding the works of the devil still held very strongly in people's minds, and regardless of whatever people would say to this day. It's a very, very sad story, but one which I'm sure you would find interesting, if not a little sympathetic to this poor young lady. And thank you, Sarah, and I hope that you can spend the rest of your time in peace and away from all those people who perhaps misjudge you so badly. And now we return back inside to the church. That was indeed an interesting tale, albeit rather sad, and perhaps sadder for the fact that nobody knows very little about this young lady. But at least by being buried here in this beautiful, quiet country church will at least give her centuries of peace from the torment that she must have suffered as a child. And that brings me on to another famous incumbent at this church, a man by the name of Sabine Baring-Gould, who was the rector here between 1871 and 1882. And what can I say about this man? He was probably one of the most prodigious writers of the period. In fact, the British Library can record at one period that the majority of submissions for registration by the library were actually works written by Baring-Gould. He came here, as he believed, as a form of punishment, and nobody knows what the punishment was for. It was certainly known that he was a very open-minded, free-thinking individual, and probably may have trodden on some toes somewhere in the church hierarchy, but he certainly wasn't happy about being posted to this church. He found the islanders very difficult people to get along with. He found them to be very suspicious and wary of outsiders, for which of course Baring-Gould was. Certainly a very interesting man. While he was here as part of his presumed punishment, he was able to write a very famous hymn with the name of Onward Christian Soldiers, which to anybody associated with the Christian faith may have heard over the years being played literally anywhere in the world. A very, very popular tune. He also wrote a book on the island and characterised the people on the island as part of this thriller which he wrote. And certainly, even to this day, people can attest to some of the descriptions of the characters in this novel to people that actually existed during Baring-Gould's time. And perhaps that was his form of revenge against them. I personally feel that the church, rather than in punishing him by sending him here, they realised that this man was a literary genius and thought that perhaps by sending him to a very quiet post, such as here, it would enable him to get on with his work. I don't think that they particularly prescribed against him. He was certainly a very interesting man. He was entirely self-educated and travelled freely across the continent on his many travels, where he acquired great knowledge and picked up some interesting items, which I believe, some of which are still here in this church today. During his period here, he actually renovated the church at his own personal expense. He was certainly a man of certain means, and if you look in a number of the windows, you will see some 16th and 17th century roundels, which are believed to be of a continental origin. And perhaps Baring-Gould acquired these on his travels and had them put into the windows here, because other than that, there is no sign of any medieval glass. And the chancel window, as beautiful as it is certainly a late Victorian masterpiece. But let's carry on with the tour inside. You'll have to excuse the rather strong light that's coming through the church windows, but here is an interesting exhibit, which is a reconstructed niche. And you can see that there are cracks in the stonework where it's been completely rebuilt. This, unfortunately, is not an uncommon phenomenon in many churches of this period, as I've already explained on earlier videos. When the church went through a period of reformation, many things that were regarded as idolatry or too Catholic were destroyed by the Protestants. And it would appear that in the early days, at least, this was actually removed and broken up. But fortunately, it's been recovered and it's been put back into place. But here, of course, would have stood a statue, probably of one of the saints. And fortunately, only the other day I was able to travel over to Fingering-Hoe Church, which has such a statue of St. Margaret, which had been removed. Her head was partially broken, and she was buried into the rubble at the back of the niche and filled in. And it was only during a period of renovation inside the church that she was rediscovered and put back onto display, which is such a terrible shame. These beautiful objects of artwork, these were handcrafted by people, these were painted by artists, and yet they were so unceremoniously disregarded and discarded as refuse. But here, at least, the niche still exists, and let's hope that perhaps one day the statue which originally filled this gap may be rediscovered and put back onto display. There's a story I want to share with you, an anecdote about Baring Gould. And he had apparently 15 children. In fact, he had so many children that on one occasion he had a party at the vicarage, and he picked up a little girl and he went, "Oh, you're pretty. Whose little girl are you?" And she burst into tears and exclaimed, "But I'm yours, Daddy." He was so wrapped up in his work and his life that he'd actually forgotten the identities of his own children. This shows you the eccentricity of that man, but a really nice story. Kind of blows through here, this wave of energy all the time. It might be cold in here, but it certainly feels warm in some way. Beautiful. On a spiritual level, I'm actually feeling, and I can actually see on the altar area, an impression in my mind of a man, a priest, and the boy wearing a white surplice as though he may have been in the choir. Whether this was the vicar and his son or some other relation, I don't know. But they feel very warm, nothing negative here at all. Well, unfortunately, time is drawing to a close here. It's starting to get dark, and this beautifully light, naturally illuminated church is slowly drawing into darkness. I hope you've enjoyed the tales that I've shared with you today, and particularly appertaining to Sabine Baring Gould and of course poor Sarah Wrench, and have been able to enjoy the beauty of this building, which for me is crucially important. Hadley was first constructed by Hubert de Burgh in 1215, and the site chosen was on a high natural ridge constructed from London clay. De Burgh realised the site afforded good views across the Thames estuary, and the castle would help to protect London from raids by French warships. The Kentish ragstone used was brought by raft across the Thames from Kent, from where it was quarried, and a ramp was constructed to haul the stone from the foreshore, which was until the 18th century at the base of the hill. Land reclamations pushed the sea much further back, which exists to this day as cultivated farmland. Hubert was a trusted follower of King John and custodian of two important royal castles at Windsor and Dover. At Dover he was soon to prove his great military skill by successfully defending the castle during a fierce siege in 1216. De Burgh was later given a licence to crenellate in 1230 under Henry III, but by 1239 his relationship with the king had deteriorated to such an extent that de Burgh was arrested and had his possessions, including Hadley, stripped from him. The castle by the 1250s had fallen into neglect, and despite some investment after it was given to Queen Eleanor in 1273, it remained in relatively poor condition. A new hall and an adjacent solar complex were built at the castle around 1290, but collapsed due to subsidence shortly afterwards. In 1299 the castle was given to Queen Margaret, and Edward III acquired the castle in 1330, and between 1361 and 1363 the internal buildings were renovated, which was completed by 1365. After 1544 the estate began to be broken up. First the parks were sold, and then the castle itself, bought by Lord Richard Rich from Edward VI for £700 in 1551. Rich dismantled the castle for the value of its stone, primarily between 1551 and 1575, and the castle, now thoroughly ruined, passed through Rich's descendants. The English painter John Constable visited Hadley in 1814 and made a drawing of the castle as preparation for 10 oil sketches and a single painting. The oil painting, Hadley Castle, was produced in 1829 and exhibited at the Royal Academy in the same year. William Booth purchased Hadley Castle and its surrounding site in 1891 for the use of the Salvation Army, which established a farm to train the English poor prior to them being sent overseas to the British colonies. Considerable subsidence and slippage on the ridge occurred between 1898 and 1923, causing a collapse of the southern curtain wall. The Salvation Army gave the castle to the Ministry of Works in 1948, and it is now owned by English Heritage and classed as a scheduled monument and a Grade 1 listed building. Subsidence and landslips have continued. The northeast tower largely collapsed in the 1950s, and further major slippages occurred in 1969, 1970 and 2002. Today I'm fortunate to be able to visit the ruins of Hadley Castle in Essex. Very recently I featured a paradocumentary on Essex witches, the centre of which was based upon the village of Canewdon, which of course was central to that particular documentary, and also featuring the arch nemesis of all witches, self-styled Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins. And of course it wasn't long before comments were raised as to why I never featured perhaps Essex's most famous cunning man, a man by the name of James Murrell. And the reason simply for that was that the paradocumentary was essentially rooted in Canewdon and also Mistley and Manningtree, because the two fitted quite nicely within the sense of one group of people that were alleged to persecute church-going people, and then an alleged churchgoer persecuting alleged witches, and so it featured quite well. But of course within the remit of that there was not enough time to talk about James Murrell and his life and his claims. James Murrell was born at Rochford in Essex in around the year 1781, And in 1785 he was baptised and grew up to become a fairly well-adjusted, normal young man, except for his mercurial gifts, accorded to him, according to legend, by the fact that he was the seventh son of a seventh son. And these gifts were pivotal for what James Murrell became in later life, a well-known cunning man, a man who was alleged to have gifts which included healing powers, herbal remedies, divining for lost objects, astrology and clairvoyance, to name but a few. In around 1812, James decided to become a cobbler and set himself up with a shop at Hadley in Essex. As his client base grew, his knowledge grew, and more people, including the wealthy, were travelling from much further afield, travelling down from London, Suffolk, Hertfordshire and even further abroad, to seek him out because of his acclaimed reputation as a seer and cunning man. He possessed a tremendous knowledge of herbal remedies, medicine and astrology, and owned an extensive library of magical books and papers. Although none of these have survived, his library is said to have contained the works of Henry Cornelius Agrippa, Michel Nostradamus and William Lilly. For his consultation room, he allegedly used the front room of his cottage, which was festooned with all types of herbs tied to the beams and slowly drying out for future remedies and clients. In the corner of that room he had an extremely large wooden chest which contains various texts and books relating to his craft as a cunning man. He also had a magical knife, a human skull, and a writing desk. But what was interesting amongst his collection was a large brass telescope. Now one can assume that the telescope was used for looking at the sky and at the stars, but as I believe, part of his reputation as a cunning man relied extensively on local intelligence, information that he could pick up or acquire locally, either directly from the individual themselves, quite innocuously, or by a third party, or, in this case, by observing people through his telescope, seeing what people were up to on a day-to-day basis, so that when they came to him, he may have had copious details of notes appertaining to that individual, which he could then reveal, which would obviously amaze and surprise the person concerned and reinforce his belief in him as a cunning man or male witch. On a day-to-day basis, Murrell would often be seen wandering around the town of Hadley, as it became, or wandering to the ruins of the old castle, where, deep in thought, he was seen muttering or whistling to himself as he walked along, no doubt thinking about particular clients or causes that he was occupied with at that particular time. But one thing about Murrell, people didn't fear him. People adored him because of his wiseness, his wisdom and his ability and creativity in the way that he could help or assist people. Now, bearing in mind, as I've always mentioned in all of my paradocumentaries, people were deeply superstitious. And of course, talk of the black magic and the black arts would frighten people, particularly devout church-going folk. And of course, Murrell was a man who had deeply held religious beliefs. He was a devout Christian. He was perhaps so well versed on the Bible and New Testament that he could quote, word for word, a particular psalm much better than the local priest, who would have to research anything that Murrell had told him as quotes from the Bible. Such was his ability and his memory is certainly key to his ability as a cunning man. He charged for his services usually half a penny for curing warts and other simple herbal remedies, half a crown to break a spell cast by another witch, and the same one for his famous witch bottle spells. But if he was asked to call upon the aid of high spirits, he would charge even more. But if a magical cure was required, then he was set about by raising spirits or good angels, as he described them. Certainly most cunning men of that period were eccentrics, and James Murrell was second to none in his own eccentricities. How would people describe him? There are certainly no photographs that exist to this day. There are drawings based upon his description, but nothing more. And this is how he was described. He was a small man in stature, but had an aura of great authority, with piercing blue eyes and a ruddy complexion. When out and about in the village, he wore a bob-tailed coat and a fashionable hard hat, and always carried an umbrella. He was a married man and then also allegedly had up to 20 children, although no records can be verified to actually establish that as fact. He also had what he called a magical mirror, which is something that he used to stare into as a seer, to be able to draw more closely into a particular problem brought to him by a client. And the mirror also served as a lost property finder. And allegedly, because of his divinations, he was able to see and locate the missing item, and had a great cause and acclaim for that particular reputation. As an astrologer, he was incredibly accurate, and many of his predictions did come true, maybe not in the immediate future, but certainly many years hence. With regard to anything spiritual, there was nothing that James Murrell could not do, and nothing, of course, that he would refuse to do to help other people. Certainly a far cry from the reputation of George Pickengill, who came later. Here we have a man that was very deeply associated with the local village and with the church. People held him in great respect. People didn't fear him. People came to him for help and for assistance, and in return he gave that assistance. He never claimed to call upon imps or demons to fight a particular enemy or evil. Instead, he used what we would call today as white magic, perhaps a predecessor of the modern Wiccan movement, perhaps. One of his claims was that he had a magical telescope. Now, whether it was the brass telescope that I mentioned earlier or some other telescope, this telescope was able to see through walls. Now remember, as I came back to earlier, about James Murrell taking notes and observing people. I think that was the purpose. It was one of the same items which he used to observe people from a distance from the telescope. Because if he looked at people from a great distance, they would never have seen him. And so anything that he could attest to at a later date was obviously a magic, a divination which has come to him through the white forces that surround him. He was never a man who was regarded as being woolly in his predictions or in his conduct. He was somebody that people very deeply admired, a local fixture perhaps. He also had a talismanic copper bracelet with which he was able to detect evil or lying people. I think, in truth, that James Murrell was a uniquely gifted psychologist. I think that the people he came across, he could get vibes off them. He very quickly was able to work out whether somebody was good or bad. And obviously there was a level of success attached to that, because certainly for here, the copper bracelet that he wore was one of the popular gimmicks that he employed in his trade as a seer. And I certainly think that people that had a guilty secret were no longer to hold that secret if they were in the presence of James Murrell. He had that cunning ability to find and seek the truth. An interesting story, which I think is largely apocryphal, but relates to James Murrell, and that concerns one of his witches' bottles. Now, his witches' bottles were made out of metal. They were cast by a local blacksmith. They weren't particularly easy to make, as many could break in the firing process, but their use and effectiveness, particularly on a psychological basis around the town of Hadley, was particularly effective. One particular famous case was a young girl who was barking like a dog. Murrell diagnosed that she was suffering from witchcraft, and so, using one of his magical spirit bottles, or witches' bottles, he heated it up in the fire, intending to give the sense of that burning back to the person that was hexing this young girl. Legend has it that the bottle exploded in the heart of the fire, and the following day the witch, the sender of this evil upon this young girl, was found dead, half burnt by fire, but there was no trace or no seat of fire. So people ascribed her death to the actions of the spirit bottle, the witch's bottle, which James Murrell had placed earlier in the hearth of his fire. Whether this was true or not, it certainly aided his reputation and increased the number of people who would come to him on a regular basis seeking help. Another story was that he killed a witch using the powers of magic, white magic, against this evil force, which allegedly came from the village of Canoodan. Now, as you recall, in later years, George Pickingill allegedly struck a witch down dead. Could this story be lifted from the reputation of Murrell and transferred by somebody else to George Pickingill? And I think certainly there are a number of claims ascribed to Pickingill which in fact could be ascribed to James Murrell. In December of 1860, Murrell became quite seriously ill and foreseen his death, which he said would occur on the 16th of December of 1860. In his final hours, the village vicar tried to minister the last rites, but when Murrell could stand it no longer, he fixed his piercing eyes upon him and roared, "I am the Devil Master." At which point the vicar got up, terrified, and ran for his life. He was later given a proper funeral in the churchyard at the church in Hadley. Unfortunately, there is no marker to this day as to where he is buried, and of course later he was joined by his family, who too were also buried in unmarked graves. And allegedly on his death certificate at time of death was written his occupation as a quack doctor. Perhaps rather insulting for the reputation and the enjoyment that his presence gave to the people of Hadley. But unfortunately, there's always been this psychological battle between the church and people like James Murrell and George Pickingill. Although I hasten to add, and I will underscore that, James Murrell did not worship any horned gods as Pickingill did. He was a deeply devout Christian. This was an extension in his mind of his teachings and understanding of the Bible. After his death, the landlord of his rented cottage where he lived placed all of his books in the chest and buried it in the garden. They were later dug up by his son, Buck Murrell, and certainly they were believed to have survived until roughly the year 1956, when they were largely taken out and burnt. Since his death, stories have proliferated about James Murrell, as indeed with George Pickingill, as indeed with any of the other more notorious witches that were extant in Essex over that period of history. And of course, it's people like Eric Maple and a few others that have stepped into the breach, picking up second-hand stories from other folk, which were rightly or wrongly attributed to either George Pickingill or James Murrell. I'm inclined to believe that much of the legends associated with James Murrell were later adopted by others to include into the legend of George Pickingill. I have absolutely no proof to prove or disprove this, but it is a theory which I think holds reasonably well in the circumstances. One of the most enduring legends that's held to this day about James Murrell is the fact that he prophesies that there will be witches in Lee for over 100 years. I think that would probably be quite a safe bet, particularly today with people's more wider interests in esoteric arts and beliefs. And perhaps in Lee today there are still those witches of old, who knows. It is a story and the legend of the story which I find fascinating. And certainly one could say that with regard to James Murrell, he was certainly a wise and cunning man, and certainly a person whose reputation and good name will probably live on for centuries to come.